District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I am your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today.
Chairman Westerman, good to reconnect with you.
Always good to visit with you, Gabriella.
First time in person, because all of our previous interviews have been done via phone call or Zoom.
Right. I think we started doing this during the pandemic. It's much better in person.
It is. I appreciate your time because you're a very busy man, and Congress has been pretty chaotic as of today's recording, a lot of happenings on Capitol Hill, but I wanted to chat with you and get an update on what's happening on the natural resources side on the committee. Overall, what is happening? Are you guys mostly doing response to rules and regulations, a lot of oversight? What's happening?
Yeah, some call it oversight. It seems more like whack-a-mole. That this administration especially, I sometimes wonder if they've got a committee over there that sits around thinking up things to get us worked up, because they're doing a pretty good job of it. And they give us a lot of opportunities to have oversight, to push back on regulations that we can't see any logic behind them or what the benefit of it is. At the same time we're doing that, we're also trying to push our agenda. I know you care a lot about conservation, hunting and fishing and wildlife, and that's something I'm very passionate about. We've passed the American Wildlife Habitat Conservation Act out of committee. We're looking at forestry management. We're really on the offense of putting good policies out and showing an alternative to this overburdensome regulatory environment that this administration's created. But at the same time we're doing that, playing offense, we have a lot of defense to play.
And what has been something recently you guys have been combating on the committee level?
Let's see, where do we start? How about BIDEH?
Yeah, I wanted you to talk about that.
Yeah.
It's a crazy rule. I was reading through it.
It's nutso. It's beyond comprehension that Fish and Wildlife would come out and say, we're not going to allow agricultural practices on fish and wildlife refuges anymore. It's like it's almost, the response is, well, then what do we need you for, Fish and Wildlife? Because we know that agriculture can play a critical role in creating habitat for wildlife. And we know it's been used on fish and wildlife refuges for a long time. I've got 5 different fish and wildlife refuges in my district. One I think about particularly is called Hollow Bend up in Yell County, Arkansas, right on the Arkansas River in the migratory bird flyway. It's a waterfowl resting area. It's been very successful. The refuge contracts out with local farmers to plant crops. The farmers harvest part of the crops, they leave part of the crops. You flood the crops, and guess what? Waterfowl love it. Under the BIDEH rule, that would go away. And I made a visit to Hollow Bend a couple of years ago because the locals were telling me Fish and Wildlife wasn't managing and their duck populations were down. And sure enough, we went out, and a combination of problems. Part of it was lack of staffing. But I think as a result of that visit, they did management that year, and guess what? The duck population increased in the area. It's a great example of, I call it the field of dreams concept. If you build it, they will come. You create habitat, wildlife will find it, and that habitat certainly can be and can incorporate agricultural practices. Now, I'm a big proponent of natural vegetation when we talk about forest and thinning forest and getting regeneration of undergrowth in the forest. We can do so much good across the country if we would create that type of habitat where we're not using any kind of intensive or lower intensity agricultural practices, but just using the natural growth of the forest. There's so many things we can do, but I don't know why this administration would want to shoot themselves in the foot and take agriculture practices off the table for fish and wildlife refuges. That's one thing we're dealing with. Then we got Fish and Wildlife saying, well, and by the way, we don't think you should use lead fishing tackle or any lead ammunition at Fish and Wildlife refuges, which is also insane. No scientific data backing what they're proposing. It's just their whim to put more regulations in place. I guess they feel like they've got a quota on regulations, and they're going to get all of them in place if they can. We could continue to pick on Fish and Wildlife, but let's move over to the weather people, NOAA. I always thought before I came to Congress, NOAA was the weather people, which they are, but they also regulate a lot of fisheries, and they're trying to impose this 10-mile-an-hour speed limit on fishing vessels, which is going to do great damage to recreational boating and recreational fishing, which it almost seems like that's what they want. You look at these onerous regulations and limits they're putting in place on snapper in many parts of the country.
One day, have you heard in
Florida?
Florida?
One day, one fish.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I've
Insane.
heard about it. Why don't they just say we're not going to have snapper season this year? But then what drives me crazy is they ignore the science. They make up their own data when you've got research institutions like the University of South Alabama that goes out, studies this stuff all the time, and NOAA and the others just ignore the data that the real researchers are putting out. And it's like they're cherry-picking data, making up their own rules. And the other part is just brazen. It's like they don't care. And that, when I said that, I could kind of feel the fire in my gut. Because when you got a bureaucrat that's putting onerous regulations on the American people and they don't care, somebody's got to fight back on that.
And that you are. And it's not conspiratorial to say that they're being influenced by the anti-hunters, anti-anglers, like all those lawsuits that triggered the lead prohibitions and also this vessel speed rule in the Atlantic, all by the usual suspects who openly hate hunting and fishing and conservation.
Exactly. And that's not the majority of America. And that's letting small special interest groups that I think have undue access to this administration and the White House and the agencies overly influence policy. And, you know, I'm one of 435 people elected to represent the people of America, and this is some place where my voice is definitely going to be heard.
I know you won't shy away from that, absolutely, and our listeners who are familiar with your work know that too. I want to ask you about kind of the environmental situation at the border. A lot of people hear about the border, it's one of the top issues, but no one really talks about the environmental toll that open border policies have created. I've heard inklings from friends who've been to the border. You've been there. I know you've reported and commented about it, but what exactly is happening to the biodiversity, the wild landscapes, and situations there? And they often say that building a border wall will be more environmentally destructive than, let's say, what's happening now. So what is your assessment into that?
They haven't been to the border because it's amazing every time I go down there. And this is something that's not getting talked about enough. 40% of the entire southern border is on federal lands. You go to Arizona, and I believe the number's 80% of the Arizona border is federal lands. The best estimate I've seen is that every migrant that comes across leaves an average of 8 to 9 pounds of trash. So multiply that times 10 million, and you're talking about a lot of trash. You talk about these so-called sensitive areas that get trampled on. People are camping in them. It's mind-blowing to me that I can go to the border and you can see where trees have been cut off of federal land to build campfires and to cook with, and it just seems to be, that's okay. But you let an American citizen go out on federal land and cut a tree down and build a campfire and see what happens to them. And this is much bigger than federal lands. The amount of illegal drugs that are coming across the border on federal lands, the amount of human trafficking that's happening. And as the sheriff in Cochise County, Arizona, told us when we did a field hearing down there, something every American needs to know. it's not an immigration or illegal immigration problem we've got, it's an organized crime problem that we've got. And these Mexican cartels are operating on our side of the border, and not just along the border, all over our country. When you enslave people in human trafficking, and basically the way this works is you have to pay a fee to come across the border, or the cartels will kill you or kill your family members. And that sounds like very dramatic, but that's just the simple truth of what's happening. Then when I say they enslave people, they force them to go to work and pay their fee off because they don't have the $5,000 or $15,000 to pay the cartels when they come across the border. So now they're here illegally and they're being forced to work to send money to the cartels, and they will kill you or kill your family if you're not doing what they want you to do. And they're spread out all across the country. We had hearings in the Natural Resources Committee with our Indian and Insular Affairs Subcommittee with tribal leaders in Montana, talking about the cartels on tribal land in Montana. These are Mexican cartels in Montana, threatening tribal leaders with death if they came to Congress to testify in Congress. It's literally kind of the expression of the Wild West on these reservations, where you've got limited law enforcement, where the federal agencies aren't out there, and you've got cartels running drug rings and growing dope on Indian reservations. And it's like there's a blind eye to it. I don't see that being reported on in the media, even though we've had hearings on it. And I've talked to tribal leaders in a lot of different places, and one of the things that they've told me about the cartels that come in and are growing marijuana on their tribal land is they use chemicals that are outlawed in the U.S. They poison the animals. They're growing this dope, and they're using any kind of materials, chemicals, animal control, whatever they can to make sure they produce the most crop. And it's happening right here in America. And that's one of the most infuriating things to me, is that we're allowing it to happen.
I've heard it from a friend of mine who was formerly in law enforcement, John Norris. He's done a lot on public lands and cartels, and he's a good resource on that. But in terms of like wildlife, have you heard any, the one story I can think of, I spoke to Congressman Mike Flood, and he told me that in his district 2 illegal immigrants killed and barbecued an American bald eagle, and it took public pressure for the Fish and Wildlife Service to actually do something and charge them with crimes. One was found, the other is still missing at large. But it seems like they're even turning a blind eye to acts committed by people who are unlawfully in this country, and then they're harming our wildlife in the process too.
It's a double standard for American citizens and illegal migrants. I mean, it's one thing if you were opening the border and saying when you come here you've got to assimilate, you're going to be held maybe even to a higher standard than an American citizen. But to say, come on in, do what you want to, you can stay here as long as you want, and creating a double standard where the American citizen is the one being discriminated against, I don't see how anybody, regardless of political party, thinks that's a good situation. And it's, talking about federal land, we've had to deal with the situation in our committee because we have jurisdiction over the National Park Service, where this administration built migrant camps on National Park Service property in New York City at Floyd Bennett Field, where over 1 million people a year go for recreation. They waived every environmental review process, every permitting rule, and it was like magic. Within a couple of weeks, they had the green light to build migrant camps on National Park Service land. That is, again, is a double standard. You would never, ever get a permit in 1,000 years for somebody from the private sector to go into public land and build something like these migrant camps, yet the federal government just waved the magic wand and it happened.
It's funny how that is. And speaking of them waving magic wands, the Antiquities Act just turned 118 years old. Maybe there's an appetite for Congress. I know your committee and your fellow Republicans have expressed an aptitude to reform it, modernize it. Are we ever going to get Antiquities Act reforms? Because Biden has just been using it just to designate different monuments to prepare for permanent protection against the will of the people.
The Antiquities Act has been abused for a long time by Democrats and Republicans, but especially by Obama, I think, greatly abused the Antiquities Act, and I think Biden's greatly abusing the Antiquities Act. But that's something that Congress needs to get control over. And when you look at all of these older laws that are on the books, what we've also found is many of these haven't been reauthorized. And really, they're only supposed to be funded to the amount they were authorized for. And if they're not authorized, they're not supposed to be funded. But because we've had so much dysfunction on funding and we do these omnibus bills, you see these programs get reauthorized through the appropriations process, and we're really pushing back on that and trying to make Congress operate the way it was designed to operate, where the authorizing committees authorize a program and then the appropriations committee appropriates to that authorization. The Endangered Species Act hasn't been reauthorized since the early 90s, I believe. So we're actually rewriting the Endangered Species Act, and we're going to have a hearing on it and vote on a reauthorization of the Endangered Species Act. And you can go down the list of these laws that were put in place with good intent that over time the legal world has found the loopholes and the ways to abuse the laws, and you got NGOs out there that are taking advantage of that, and they've turned into something they were never intended to be. So it's time for Congress to regain control of that, and the way you do that is through the reauthorization. And I think we've got to start taking a harder stand and saying, look, if this isn't authorized, it shouldn't be funded either. So I think that should give us leverage on how to reauthorize and to rework these laws and to bring them up to today's standards.
Yeah, when you're looking at the environmental impact statements of Bears Ears and all these other proposals, it makes your head spin, and they're just so blatant with the preferred alternatives to say that they're going to cut off access to recreation. And they say that they're protecting public lands, and they get away with that.
Yeah, there's a lot of, well, Reagan said it best. He said, it's not that my friends across the aisle are intentionally lying, they just know so much about what isn't so. And they like to talk about it a lot. And they use manipulative tactics to say, oh, we want to protect our federal lands. Well, who doesn't want to protect our federal lands? But it's a way to say, to push these radical policies that at the end are going to deny access to the American public. We've got this great system in our country with public lands where every American has a piece of that. But if you can't access it and use it, what do you really have? And we're moving towards this model, and it's small things like the lead ammo and lead fishing tackle. You may think, what does that have to do with access? Well, if you look at the alternatives to lead, they're very expensive. So you're going to start gradually pushing lower income people away from being able to recreate on public lands. And it's a death by 1,000 cuts. And then they go for the big kill where they want to do stuff like redefine land use and say there's this idea that land use is conservation. That's so foreign to try to say that the land use is conservation, because conservation is not a use. Conservation is an ethic that you implore as you use the land. But by changing the lexicon, by coming up with new definitions and saying conservation is a use, their next step is to be able to sell conservation leases so that somebody can come in, and now they're trying to raise money on Wall Street where even foreign investors could invest in these natural asset companies. go in and buy a, quote, lease, a conservation lease on federal lands, which that may sound okay until you look at it and say, well, what does that mean? That means whoever holds that lease gets to determine what the use is and who has access to it. So you've taken public lands and you've sold them to some interest on Wall Street, which could be a foreign interest that's going to lock up the land, and it's denying access to the American public. So again, when I say there's plenty of stuff for us to push back on, this is just another one of those issues.
I did weigh in on the NAC stuff very heavily too, through different venues, because it's crazy now that it's morphed into natural asset capital. I think they have a new form, and there's like all this accounting measures and maneuvers in OMB, and I think that's what we all have to look out for.
It's a concerted effort between the administration at the highest levels and the Wall Street elitist and foreign investors at the highest levels to create a system to block the average person out.
It really is to keep people off public lands, and that would be very much undermining.
And it sounds good. We're going to conserve these lands. No, you're not. You're going to lock them up, and you're going to use this misdefinition of conservation to try to push this agenda on the American people and dupe the American people. And that's why it's important that we stand up and call those things out.
Yeah, the BLM conservation landscape rule, which those leases, you probably have seen the fact sheet, it would actually greenlight even worse environmental destruction by allowing utility scale like solar, wind unchecked. So they're blatant about, this will be acceptable, but hunting, fishing, no, can't be acceptable.
Yeah, I saw and you know that I'm a forester. I saw a beautiful, mature forest close to my home, clear cut, and I thought, wow, I guess somebody's going to build a housing development in there. And time progressed, and I started seeing the solar panels go in. And I thought, now isn't that environmentally friendly to cut down a mature forest and put solar panels up where they're going to have to go out there and spray herbicide to keep the plants from growing up around the solar panels. And we're seeing farmland in my state where these companies are coming in and paying outrageous amounts, like $10,000 an acre for farmland, where they're putting solar panels up and taking that farmland out of production. That is not good for the environment. It's not good for the economy, and it's not good for energy and our national security when you realize that those solar panels are being built in China mostly.
Any final thoughts you want to add that we haven't touched upon?
Oh, there's so much stuff that we could add, but I know we're running out of time. I really appreciate you taking on this calling to get the word out that through your podcast, and for the time that you've had me on. And I hope your listeners will continue to tune in, and that you'll be able to amplify the message, and that you'll get the truth out there. I think when people hear the true facts and they understand what we're facing and what's at stake, that people will get more involved and they will become more active in the process.
The podcast helps, but I talk to a lot of regular people, hunters and anglers, and they're aware and they're heightened, and they're appreciative of representatives like you who represent their best interests in Congress. I don't know if you hear that often, but there are a lot of people across the country who do appreciate your pushback to that. So I appreciate having you on again, but in person this time. Thank you, Chairman.
We'll have to do it again.
Yes.
If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.